Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is my New York. Jimmy Breslin died last week. If you asked him what he accomplished in his life, he would tell you he was a newspaperman. He considered it an honorable profession. What did it take to be a newspaperman? Here's Jimmy.
Somebody with 2 feet that he's not afraid to use, with a curiosity, which can take him any place and he should follow it, an energy to sit down when you have this stuff and write it and spend hours and hours to get it into a column. And that's a newspaperman.
Breslin was much, much more, of course, and today I hope to present to you the man in full, in his own words, and through the eyes of his friend and former colleague, esteemed and honorable newspaperman Sam Roberts. Jimmy Breslin, a life, a special 1-hour celebration, next. I can't think of anyone better to help paint a portrait of Jimmy Breslin than his friend and former colleague, Sam Roberts. Good to see you, Sam. Welcome back.
Thanks, Tony. A pleasure to be here under these circumstances, unfortunately.
Yeah, and especially you're the person who got the call from Ronnie Eldridge, his wife, that he had died.
Yeah, I had spoken to Jimmy just on Friday. I heard he was in the hospital with pneumonia and called, and they had just gotten home, and Ronnie put him on the phone, and he sounded pretty good, sounded fine. And then I got a call Sunday morning early saying that he had gone to the bathroom, come back, and just plopped down in bed and died. And I guess in a way that's the way Jimmy would have wanted to go. No anguish, no suffering, no long-term hysterics, just end it.
Yeah. I think it's the way we all want to go, as fast. It occurred to me that we lost a couple of very powerful and influential voices last week. I mean, Jimmy, Chuck Berry, people who taught us to listen in a new way, in a way that we hadn't perhaps before them.
That's true, and especially at a time when we talk a lot about free speech. We talk a lot about the fact that we're not getting enough of that from Washington, perhaps. And I think what people don't seem to stop and think enough about these days is that free speech is not just about talking, it's also about listening, listening to other people and listening to what they have to say. And one of the things that Jimmy certainly was a great listener, a great person who could interpret, synthesize other people's voices. And he heard voices, particularly in this city, that for the large part went unlistened to. He was the interpreter of the voice of the people of New York.
He got out there. I mean, you would often hear Jimmy talk about legs. That's what a reporter had to have. That was his biggest asset, legs, meaning you go to the people, you get out in the streets, you find those folks that, others are not listening or don't know are even there.
Well, that's right, Tony. He said that journalism was all about a 4-letter word, W-O-R-K. And that's really what it came down to. I remember, when I was city editor of the News, and I'll never say Jimmy worked for me, he worked with me. I once told him one day I didn't really feel well. I, was thinking of staying home. And Jimmy said on the phone, "I've got 2 words for you." And I said, "What are they?" And he said, "Wally Pip." And I said, "Who's that?" I didn't know. And this was before Google, so I had to look him up. And of course, Wally Pip had a headache one day in 1925 and decided to sit out the Yankee game.
He was
and for the next
baseman.
2,130 games, Lou Gehrig took his place at first base. Well, I never took a day off since then. And Jimmy was absolutely right. It's all about work. It's all about going out there and doing your job. And that's something Jimmy did. When, people said, oh, he just sat behind his desk and he cogitated, and he went out there and worked. He went out there and climbed those 8 or 12 flights of steps in public housing. He didn't drive, so he had his
it's
wife or the kids drive him around.
That's amazing.
It is.
You know, with the, because and you probably worked stories with him, and you there as a reporter, him looking for a column. I was certainly on stories where he was there, and I'm thinking, how did Jimmy get here? Because he didn't drive.
That's right. And the kids were remarkably patient, Kevin and James and Patrick in particular, and they drove him all over the place. And of course, in the course of that, got an incredible education about New York and about people.
You couldn't get a PhD like that anyplace else but at the University of Breslin.
No, the University of Breslin, the University of the Streets, the University Without Walls. What you could learn from Jimmy Breslin was enormous. That didn't mean you had to take everything at face value and that you couldn't question it and you couldn't poke him and say, wait a minute, do you really believe this? But his instincts, his intuition, his willingness to question, his curiosity, were just unparalleled.
Let's let Jimmy introduce himself, at least his beginnings, to you in his own words.
I write for a living, and it isn't the easiest occupation there is. I find it very difficult. And I started very young. I was in high school and couldn't wait to get out of high school. John Adams High School, 102nd Street and Rockaway Boulevard, Ozone Park, Queens. I walked out of it, I say I finished. That's debatable. I went to work at the Long Island Daily Press, which was then a newspaper, and I went at night when I was 15 years old as a copy boy. Just by being around, I ran into people in crime I was doing the best at. I looked at them and I wrote a book about them that wound up as a movie. That was very early in my life for a lot of money, which I made sure I blew. Politicians were not close on an honesty scale with gangsters. Whom you could believe gangsters, you never could believe politicians.
We're going to talk a lot about politicians and gangsters, Jimmy, but I was wondering, what was he writing in these last 5 years or 10 years or recently?
Well, he was working on a novel. It was part autobiographical, I think, about fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he would, every day, he would go to that keyboard and, bang out words. I'm not sure exactly what they were, and I hope that somehow they get put together into the book that he hoped to write. But there he was every day, no matter how he felt, he would go to that keyboard and keep writing, and that's what kept him alive. He used to say, particularly working for a newspaper, that it was rage that drove him. And that was absolutely true, that, going to work every day, he would sometimes wallow in bed until he got worked up over some subject or other. And as he said in that clip, you could see it was very easy to get him worked up, and the thing that worked him up most were politicians, because unlike gangsters, he saw the hypocrisy in many politicians. Criminals weren't that hypocritical. You knew what you were getting. They were criminals. They were crooks. They were committing crime. Politicians, the ones who weren't good, he respected the ones who were, although admittedly he didn't find many who were good. But the ones who weren't, he thought they were terrible hypocrites because they pretended to be otherwise.
Let's talk about that rage, which he talked about himself. He said there was a rage in him, and that he thought, or others perhaps thought of him, that he told the stories of so many people in his journalism, in his columns, somehow, and I don't want to be a 10-cent psychologist here, but somehow subsuming his own story, about which he was very angry. A father who abandoned the family when he was 6, a mother who was apparently a drunkard. And I think I remember him saying or reading somewhere, he said, I don't know who I was 67 people in my life, 67 different people. Talk about that a little.
Well, his mother was also, I believe, a teacher. I mean, he did not come from a totally uneducated family. He certainly read a lot. One of his heroes was Yeats. He had a manuscript up on the wall in his house, in fact. So, for all the street smarts that he acquired, he was also a very well-read, very educated man. But he met all of these people, and he immersed himself in all of these people. I'm not going to engage in pop psychology, but part of it, I think, was to, bury his own persona a little bit, which he, tried to escape. He wasn't happy with that. And one of the ways you do that, maybe me too, by being a journalist, is you stand on the sidelines and watch everyone else. Maybe an actor does that as well. Maybe that's the, as the Meyer Lansky figure in The Godfather says, that's the profession we choose. You're not an actor in it in the sense of acting. You are not a participant in it. You are an observer. If you think of the black woman on welfare or someone who is being the victim of some sort of injustice, there was nothing that got Jimmy Breslin's juices going more than that, to be fighting for someone who is a victim of some sort of wrongdoing or some sort of abuse by powerful people or by a powerful system.
And as another example, that young man, he wrote columns about a young man with AIDS before anybody was paying much attention to this scourge. He was writing columns. I'm sorry, I forgot the man's name, David something, I think, and won a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, because and the reason he knew about that was he was out talking to people. He was out on the streets. He was out talking to doctors. It wasn't sitting home reading the paper or listening, to the radio or watching TV. He was out, and so he heard what was going on. He knew those things. So every morning when I was at the Daily News and I was city editor, I would talk to him every morning, and I would pick up, a million stories just hearing what he had been doing the night before, because he was out everywhere. And that is how you get news. It doesn't just wind up in your lap. It's out talking to people.
Was it the Daily News where you first met him?
Yes. I came to the news directly from college. And you've got to remember what a different time that was in New York. Not only what a different time it was for working at a tabloid newspaper, but those were the days when the Daily News had a circulation every day of more than 2 million, a Sunday circulation of more than 3 million, where at night, for the first edition of the Daily News, people would be lined up at 7:30, 8:30 at night to get the paper. So a columnist had enormous power and an enormous following. And so someone who was writing that column, just had an immense power, an immense influence, so that when he or she wrote about something that was going on in government, something that was touching a nerve, it had enormous impact. It changed things.
So you come to the news right out of college. Is Jimmy Breslin at this time big JB already?
JB, I think, came a little bit later. I think he may have come.
But he was already established.
Oh, he was certainly a big figure, no question.
Was he an ideal of yours? And had you said at some point in your college career, gee, I want to be that like that? Or?
Well, sure, because you knew that Jimmy Breslin had his finger on the pulse of New York. He was a Mr. New York. He was a Damon Runyon type character. Someone who embodied New York.
You talked about him being a Damon Runyon character, and Jimmy invented a whole group of Damon Runyon characters, I guess based on some real people, but there was Unocchio, there was...
and these were real people.
Marvin the Torch,
right,
an arsonist.
Klein the lawyer, Fat Thomas.
Fat Thomas the bookie.
These were real characters.
Yeah.
They, the names were changed to protect the guilty, but these were indeed real characters. Some of them were embellished a little bit.
Yeah, I think from his, the streets of Queens where he grew up, I think, I never quite knew who. I did meet Fat Thomas once at NBC, and he was fat and he was a bookie. I'm not sure what his real name was, but, it's funny, Sam, I guess we all have favorite things about Jimmy, many of them, and I'm proud to say he was an idol of mine. Before I was in New York in this business, I mean, I was in the business, but in some little town somewhere, and I met a college kid at the station I was working at who had been to the Indiana primary. This is 1968, Bobby Kennedy.
Sure.
And he had been to the Indiana primary. He came back to our newsroom 4 or 5 days later, said, I met Jimmy Breslin. And I said, you met Jimmy Breslin? What's he like? Tell me everything. The man, I had consumed Jimmy at that point through the pieces that he wrote about these characters in New York Magazine when it was the Sunday supplement of the Tribune. I still have some of them. They're yellow at home. Great stories.
Great slices of New York. I mean, these were, real people, somewhat, as I say, embellished and slightly fictionalized, but they captured the character of New York, certainly as it was then. Well,
Onocchio was his mafia boss.
Right, Onocchio was very closely patterned after Fat Tony Salerno in East Harlem.
Yeah. And Jimmy, as we talked about already, I think that, he preferred politicians to mob bosses because... he preferred mob bosses to politicians because, as you said, at least with the mob guys, you knew what you were getting.
Right.
He once, I'm sure more than once, but we have a clip of Jimmy, his prescription for erasing crime in our city. Listen to this.
You get the mafia to line up all the hedge fund operators, these smooth-faced Protestants making $30 million a year.
So you like Catholics and Jews better, obviously. No, go ahead.
You line them up on the wall and have the mafia come in and shoot them all.
Nice.
Then you arrest the mafia for the murders, and you know what you've just done? Eliminated crime.
That was sort of a Jonathan Swiftian modest proposal.
Yes.
And that was what Jimmy was all about. He was totally outrageous.
Simple, isn't it?
Totally outrageous, and he knew he was being outrageous. But of course, he would make you think in different ways. You didn't necessarily have to agree with him. In fact, if you did, you were crazy half the time.
Right.
But he made you think. He made you think in different ways. And his writing was so different, so that when everyone was covering, an ordinary event or covering it in an ordinary way, he would go after the gravedigger at Kennedy's funeral. He would go after the cop who, was responding to John Lennon's murder. He would go after that element of the story that no one else was going to get, and told the story in a fascinating, different way. So that he was not part of the scrum of journalists.
Yeah, he said. He said anyway. It came out of his background as sports writer, where he learned early, or he believed early, that the real story was to go to the losers' locker room. Forget everybody else with the winners. I'm going to the losers' locker room. There's a better story there, and he was right often. And the gravedigger to that piece, of course, is journalism legend. If you don't know, on the assassination of President Kennedy, everybody goes to Washington.
And he loved losers in whatever form. The fact that he fought against the supersonic transport, the Concorde, and sided with the people in Howard Beach, Queens, who were worried about the noise, among other things. And one of my great triumphs was sending him home from Europe on the Concorde when it just started running. And, it was amazing that the Daily News paid for it at the time. But I was trying to get a column out of him as quickly as possible, and I kept calling British Airlines, which hated him anyway because he was Irish and kept attacking the British. And I said, well, is the plane landed yet? Is it coming in? Is it on time? And the spokesman for British Airlines said, well, I've got good news and bad news for you. He said, the good news is the plane has just landed. The bad news is it's landed in Labrador because we had engine problems. So the first time the Concorde has ever had engine problems, it has to be down for a forced landing, and Jimmy Breslin is on it. And I see a black and white photo of this plane landing and the passengers getting off. And in this black and white photo, I can see Jimmy Breslin's face in green because he was so terrified of being on this plane.
I was going to say, I hope he got a great column out of it.
He got a great column out of it, of course.
Just
not on time in this case.
Right.
He had a good excuse, but he got a great column.
Just to close the loop on that, the gravedigger, in case you don't know, and you should know, that Jimmy goes to Washington and instead and doesn't go with the scrum. He finds the man who's digging the grave in which President Kennedy's going to be buried.
$3 an hour.
For $3 at $3.01 an hour, and writes poetry on deadline.
Yep.
Poetry on deadline.
And that's what he did. And he handed it in, banged it out on a typewriter, one take at a time. It always came out to the right length. It came out in, just about perfect grammar. Sid Penner was often the editor on the city desk who edited it. And sometimes Sid would look at him and say, Jimmy, I don't understand what you're writing. And Jimmy, instead of some people who might be temperamental and throw a fit and say, what do you mean? Jimmy would cringe that somebody didn't understand, somebody whom he respected didn't understand what he was writing or explained to him how he could make it better, and just went back and made it better because he was a perfectionist. Yeah. He wanted it to be the best that it could possibly be.
Let's get back to his love-hate relationship with politicians. I mean, I think Hugh Carey probably symbolizes that. He really liked Hugh Carey and early on, and then turned on him and started to call him Society Carey. And in the magnificent phrase of Dan Barry in the obit in the Times, the epithet Society Carey stuck to him like gum on a handmade shoe.
It did indeed. Perfect phrase, and Dan did a wonderful obituary in the New York Times. Jimmy would have loved it. And Jimmy loved Hugh Carey because Hugh Carey was a man of the people, a man of the streets.
Didn't mind having a drink and
Park Slope in Brooklyn. Hung out at P.J. Clark's. Was a good governor who rose to the occasion at the right times. But then he took on a dentist in Shelter Island who was, I think, building a house that was blocking his view. And Hugh Carey used or tried to use the powers of the state police to block this guy. And right. Jimmy resented this abuse of authority and was going to have none of it. So just overnight changed his attitude toward Hugh Carey, and he became Society Carey, and that was the end of it. Yeah. And that did stick. And, it just struck exactly the right note. He was also going out with Evangeline Gouladis.
Yeah, I can't remember.
So, I mean, what Jimmy was so good at was finding the chord, that responsive chord that captured the emotion, captured the resonance of what everyone else felt, whether it was in a phrase or a sentence or a title. And nothing stuck better than Society Carey for Governor Hugh Carey. He tried it with other people. That was the best.
Yeah, no, that would, yeah. I'm surprised on his gravestone it doesn't say Society Carey. It stuck that much. We talked about his hard work, and he was on the streets. And maybe his biggest scoop, certainly one of the biggest, involved couple of politicians, several politicians, Ed Koch, Donald Maness, Stanley Friedman. There had been in this city a scandal in the Koch administration involving the Parking Violations Bureau. The story was out there, but the dots hadn't been connected. And in a Sunday front page in the Daily News, I'll never forget this, I pick up the Sunday paper, and there on the front page, he's got it nailed. Excuse me. He exposes that the whole criminal enterprise traces to Donnie Maness, who was the Queensborough president and the Democratic leader. He's got it nailed in there, and things were never the same with Koch after that.
Nor with Maness.
Well, nor with Maness, who
Queens
eventually committed suicide.
And, you know, what Jimmy was probably most upset about was that these people were friends, they were acquaintances, they were people he hung out with, and they were stealing and not telling him that all of this was going on almost behind his back. And I think that's what he probably felt betrayed about more than anything else. If they had told him, you know, it almost would have been not quite acceptable, but okay, there it would have been out in the open. But this was going on, and imagine they didn't tell him so he could have written about it. So here they are behind his back engaging in all of this corruption, not telling him so he could write about it. And he, you know, it starts to leak out. So he goes to the source, the man who is actually involved in it and talking to federal prosecutors.
The bagman, yeah.
Right, who he persuades to spill the beans to him, which he does.
You couldn't make a bigger impact in those days because you had already talked about it. The Daily News in 1986 was still this powerful organ, and the Sunday paper, the front page, the whole thing, this is there. Now, here's...
I mean, the Daily News was, remember, Ford to City dropped dead. The Daily News was that headline. When we had a good story on the front page of that paper, the circulation would go up 100, 200,000 a day. Now, maybe, you know, in the days of 1 million followers on Twitter or 100,000 hits in a story, that pales by comparison. But people going out and paying 25 cents or 50 cents for a newspaper because of that one headline, that was pretty big impact.
Here's an anecdote from that story. So he blows it up on Sunday in the paper. Monday, as you know, Koch would hold an 11 o'clock press conference at City Hall every day. So the 11 o'clock press conference on Monday is jammed. And Jimmy's in the crowd. Jimmy never went to those things, but he's in the crowd. And I'll never forget this. I got there, I thought in plenty of time, there was no more room. So I'm standing in the back next to Murray Kempton. And Murray taps me on the shoulder and he says, I hate Jimmy when he's loafing, and I loathe him when he's working hard. And, I mean, you know,
and there was another man who
from
could,
another,
yes,
you know, Pulitzer Prize winner, extraordinary man.
Murray was great, and of course we shouldn't leave out Pete Hamill from that equation too.
No.
When I had the great pleasure and honor of having both of them to work with at the Daily News, each of them with their finger on sort of a different pulse of the city, that was fabulous. And of course, I'm sure you're going to bring it up, but Jimmy's relationship, or if we call it that, with David Berkowitz, the 44 caliber killer, I mean, that was a fascinating thing too. And the fact that he chose Jimmy Breslin to write to, of all the reporters, of all the public officials, of all the cops in New York, for him to be communicating with Jimmy Breslin was, you know, not a sense of honor or distinction, but it was an indication of who represented New York.
Yeah.
I mean, the person who he would pick to communicate with, who represented the city, was not the mayor, not the police commissioner, it was Jimmy Breslin.
And Jimmy tells a harrowing story. Apparently, he was in a bar or restaurant out in Queens somewhere during the time that Berkowitz is shooting these women in cars. And what he finds this out later, I guess from Berkowitz or from the cops, that Berkowitz actually drove past the restaurant or whatever that Jimmy was in, and the dog, who was in, Berkowitz's crazy head, and he was listening to the dog, he was going to shoot Jimmy, but the dog said, "Don't shoot Jimmy. Don't do that."
Right.
Yeah. You got any more details on that?
I believe you told it pretty well, and that's just a scary story of how close, he came to being much more involved in that story than people imagine.
Yeah.
And the letters that came to Jimmy. I mean, the funny thing is he never actually saw the real letters because they came to his office and his secretary and came to the city desk, and then we turned them over to the police. So he saw copies, but not the real letters.
No. We talked a little bit about, I was going to ask you this question, but maybe it's already been answered. What is it about mobsters and columnists? I mean, Murray loved mobsters. I remember at Murray's 70 or 75th birthday celebration at Newsday, the date he brought to the event was Carmine Persico's wife, and stunned his bosses when he introduced Mrs. Persico. She was the wife of a mobster.
Well, when you look at some of the great columnists, whether it's Pete or Jimmy or Murray, Mike Daly, Jim Dwyer at the Times, other people, first of all, mobsters are colorful characters. Of course, they commit crimes, some of them horrible crimes, some of them involved in horrible things like drug dealing and obviously murders. But they are colorful characters to write about. And they are not, unlike many politicians, not hypocrites. I mean, as you said, what you see is what you get. And there's something disarming about that.
Well, as an editor, do you, many roles you've played in your life in the newspaper business, but as an editor, do you wonder about the fine line between glorifying these people with columns like Jimmy's and just telling a story?
I don't know is the answer. I don't think we ever really glorify them. I think people like to read about them. I don't think they went out and committed crimes so that we would write about them. In fact, there was one case at the Daily News on a Sunday where some guy came to the news to surrender, and we called around, and it turned out nobody wanted him. So I don't think we were generating crime by writing about these people. But people like to read about. You look at movies like The Godfather, you look at movies today that are commercial successes. People like to read about it.
Too bad the movie that was made of the gang that couldn't shoot straight was so bad.
Yes, it was.
Shut up your face.
Hey, yo. Hey, yo.
No.
Jimmy Breslin's The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. A ridiculous look at disorganized crime.
The book was...
you wonder if there could possibly be a remake, but the book was fabulous.
Yeah.
And Jimmy captured the mobsters perfectly. And, The Good Rat was another case, and much more recent book by Jimmy. He just got in that these are, ordinary people. They're not, criminal masterminds by any means. They're people who are typically over their heads. They are not, great Professor Moriartys of crime. The way he writes about them as ordinary human beings just makes them so much more charming.
The Good Rat is another example of Jimmy, of a big story, but him finding a way in that was different and interesting and compelling. The story was, a couple of cops were really ripping off drug dealers or something.
Right.
But, so it's a great story, corruption in the police department. But he doesn't go for them. He finds the Good Rat was an accountant or something?
The guy walks in, a businessman. He had on a shirt and tie and suit, glasses, receding hair. He was in his 60s, just starting. He sat down with your name, Burton Kaplan. Now I'm presently incarcerated at Allenwood Prison. Are you in the mafia? And he says, no, I can't be because I'm Jewish. With that, I sat up. I says, now look at this, my man.
That is what was so great about Jimmy, that when he decides to write about Watergate, he doesn't write about Nixon. He writes about Tip O'Neill and the Watergate Committee. Finds the entry point and finds the unusual angle of a story in a way that nobody else would ever think of.
Let's talk about a piece of his character that wasn't so admirable, which some have called sexist. He seemed to have, at least at times in his life, a kind of uncomfortable relationship with women in a newsroom, and in fact at one point was suspended by Newsday for some sort of rant that was apparently racist against an Asian American.
Yeah, it was racist, no question. And the thing is, I mean, Jimmy ranted about everybody, and mores changed. He also used to smoke in the newsroom. People don't do that anymore. And you can't apologize for it. There were things that were acceptable that no longer are. It's a good thing they no longer are, but there was a day where you could say things about people, sexist things, racial things.
Right, and it didn't.
He didn't mean them, I'm sure, but he said nasty things like that about everyone.
Everybody, yes.
And there was, I think, no less prejudiced person that I've ever met in my life. And there was no one who fought more for the underdog, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or anything else, more than Jimmy Breslin. So it was one of those things where times had changed and his behavior had not.
Betsy Wade on this program told a wonderful anecdote about Jimmy. Betsy was the first woman copy editor hired by the New York Times, and later was a leader of the lawsuit that...
Betsy's great.
Anyway, Betsy was here. She told this wonderful anecdote. In the middle 50s, she meets Jimmy at a news operation called NEA, the Newspaper Enterprise Association, somewhere on the 8th Avenue or something in the 30s.
They probably were syndicating his column.
Yeah. So Betsy liked to work in the newsroom with her shoes off. And it's summertime, and okay. So Breslin sees this, comes over, grabs her shoes, and tosses them out the window, the 14th floor window of this office. And Betsy goes, so she gets in the elevator, goes downstairs, recovers her shoes, comes back up, Breslin's not there. Where is he? He's in a bar across the street, Smith's Bar. She walks into Smith's Bar, walks up to Jimmy, and says, Mr. Breslin, I think you better put these back on my feet. And he's a little nonplussed, but he does. Okay. Couple of years later, several years later, she's at the Times. Gay Talese says, let's go out to lunch. There's a bar across the street. There's a guy who wants to meet you. So Gay takes her to whatever place this was, walks in, and he's bringing her up to meet Jimmy Breslin. And Gay is saying, Jimmy, I'd like you to, and he stopped. Gay, no, I already know this woman. This is one hell of a broad. And that was about the highest compliment a person. You wouldn't say that to anybody today.
Well, exactly.
That was a very big compliment.
You couldn't get away with saying that, but to him it was a compliment. Exactly.
Yeah, and she took it, I don't know if she took it then as a compliment, but she certainly enjoys telling the story.
Sure. And Jimmy used to run those lists of people he wasn't talking to.
Right. People I'm not talking to this year.
You know, he could carry a grudge. I mean, there was a part Sicilian to him, I think. And, you know, he carried the grudge so long that he forgot why he wasn't even talking to people. And there were people he had such a grudge against that he wouldn't even print their name anymore because he didn't want to give them the satisfaction. So he would start printing their initials, you know, just so they wouldn't get any credit in the paper or the magazine for having their name there.
We have to, we could probably create a dictionary-sized book of his great lines, but there are a couple I was racking my brain. I didn't have to rack it too hard because they stick. Who could possibly ever have described Rudy Giuliani better than Jimmy? He called Rudy a small man looking for a balcony.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Does that get any better?
Yeah, and just think of the image that conjures up. I mean, you can just see it in your mind, and, there he is.
Yeah. I remember another great line. I remember 60 Minutes did a piece back when Times Square was being Disneyfied. Disney Corporation was coming in and changing this seedy part of New York into what we now see. And 60 Minutes decided to do a piece about that, and they interviewed, among others, Jimmy Breslin. And you see him on camera, and he's listening to the question from whoever's, Disney is going to take over 42nd Street? I'll take the hookers. 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
60 Minutes.
Right.
With what? 15, 20 million viewers that show gets? I'll take the hookers.
Mm-hmm. That's our Jimmy.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the other fascinating dynamics here is just the family and the dynamic when he remarried and married Ronnie Eldridge, and you had this, I wouldn't call it melding because that's an overstatement, of the Irish family and the Jewish family and the dynamic between them, which made and almost literally made for a perfect sitcom between the two of them. I mean,
well, he said about that. There was a phrase years ago that I don't know, some sociologist came up with for that kind of a marrying of a couple of families called blended family.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this family never blended.
No, it was not a melting pot.
No,
absolutely not. And Ronnie Eldridge was a great woman to oversee it.
Yeah. Well, he said about it himself. Everybody hated everybody. Mm-hmm. It was beautiful.
Right.
Which was one of his highest
compliments.
Compliments. It was beautiful. Everybody hated everybody. It was beautiful. And I hope it was beautiful.
Well, the one thing he could not stand to be was bored, and he was never bored by that relationship.
Let's talk about, not a lot is made about his sports writing, and of course he didn't stay at that very long, but he stayed long enough in the beginning and wrote a book called Can Anybody Here Play This Game? Mm-hmm. 1962 Mets.
Which is how he actually got introduced to the Herald Tribune, because he was writing about the Mets and Mrs. Payson, and through that relationship, he met her brother, Jock Whitney,
right,
who
was running
the Herald Tribune.
Yeah.
And of course, he said to Jock, "Your sister's one hell of a babe," which you couldn't get away with today either. And Jock agreed with him and said, "Why don't you come work for me?" And Jimmy was not really prepared at that point to go back to work for newspapers. He had left the Long Island Press to write a book and thought he would keep doing that. But that was the best thing that ever happened to him and us, because he went to the Trib and then through that to New York Magazine and had a whole other career, which was great for everybody.
Where does a kid who, as he said in that clip we used much earlier, he didn't want to stay in high school. He dropped out of high school. He wanted to be in newspapers.
He wrote very early. He wrote for his high school paper, too, and he wrote sports. Yeah. I saw some of those early pieces he did with little illustrations, and he covered college sports. And he was clearly into that, and whether that came from his mother or his aunt, I'm not sure what the actual genesis or genetic derivation of that was, but he clearly had writing in him in some way.
Well, I guess that's what I'm wondering. I mean, his high school dropout from Queens, yes, he had a a mother who encouraged him to read, and there was that kind of a background in the family. But all of a sudden writes a book, about a baseball team, and out of that, as you were just saying, gets a job as a columnist at one of the great papers in the city at the time, the Herald Tribune. Where does that come from? It's just innate talent? Ingenium is a word I learned in my Latin, 101 or something?
Good for you. That's why Latin is good to know. One of the interesting things that you bring up is how many great writers and reporters were first sports writers. Hamill, David Halberstam, Dan Barry.
Red Smith.
Lots of people who later became either general assignment reporters or columnists were started off as sports writers. And whether that gave them the freedom, whether, they could use more adjectives, whether there was a certain structure in how a game is played, it's fascinating that how many of them came from that field first.
Yeah. It fascinates me because I've always had a love for the written word, and I don't know why I wound up in this side of the business and not yours, where I would actually be writing. I mean, I wrote the stories that I covered, but I have a great love for newspapers, and I think I got into the wrong field. Anyway,
I think you made out okay.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here talking with you. I'm glad to have this program and opportunity. But I have a real, more than high regard, just a reverence for good writing, and certainly Jimmy. What is it in the DNA of these guys? A lot of them Irish.
Well, that's true, and there's something poetic about that. When you look, there's certainly a disproportionate number of good Irish writers generally, and in this city, and it is a certain it's those synapses that are able to string words together to say what you mean, to know exactly the right word. When I write now, I am amazed when I find exactly the right word I'm looking for, and how important it is to pick just that right word. And we can be talking now, and I can think later, why did I use that word instead of the other? But when you're writing in a written word, you can, if you have the time, of course, you can go back and change it. And that's a luxury that is really terrific. And, that's an advantage that the written word gives you. Of course, there are deadlines that prevent you from going back too often. But that is one big advantage over the spoken word, over oral conversation that the written word provides.
I used to have occasions to talk to students, and I would always be asked, how do I get, in some form, how do I get into television, how do I become a reporter? And the answer I would always give, the first answer I would always give is learn how to write. Mm-hmm. How do you learn how to write? Well, I suppose there are courses, I don't know. But to me, and what I would always tell them is, read good writing.
Yes.
Okay, how do you do that? And I said, you know what, do you read newspapers? And of course, we're talking dark ages now. This is when I'm talking to these kids, is 20, 30 years ago. I said, for a quarter, on the newsstand every day, it's the New York Times or the Daily News. And there are people in that newspaper, those newspapers, and I would give names. Read this person, read that person. Read them. Read them every time they're in there, 3 times a week. And maybe by osmosis, I said, I don't know how to teach writing. Nobody taught Jimmy Breslin how to write.
No, I'm sure he never took a writing course.
Oh. And, we're talking about this great man, great journalist, and perfect example. I was almost in tears of joy reading Dan Barry's obit. If you haven't read that, thank God for the internet, you can Google it or whatever you do to find it. Read what Dan Barry wrote as an obit of Jimmy Breslin.
It was perfect.
The writing is luminous.
It was an advance obit.
Right,
He had
of
the
course.
good fortune not to write it on deadline.
Yeah.
But,
well, which is like, I mean, there was that great piece in the paper the other day about an obit 6 years in the making.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because I had written one ages ago about David Rockefeller, and as I was writing it, a friend of mine who worked for Rockefeller said, "I want to warn you of one thing." And I said, "What are you going to tell me, that he's a friend of the publisher or something?" He said, no, nothing like that. He said, "I just want to let you know that 4 New York Times reporters have written advance obits of David Rockefeller, and they're all dead."
I'm glad you're still here.
Me too.
Yeah. Maybe we should just spend 30 seconds on the art of the obit and how it gets. I mean, yeah, obviously Dan Barry didn't produce that on deadline. He probably could have.
He could have, absolutely.
But you know, you're writing obits for the Times now. You know, they prepare these over the years, and the most famous. Well, I consider him the most famous obit writer, Alden Whitman.
Sure.
Mr. Bad News is what Talese called him.
That's right.
He used
the angel of death.
the angel. Yeah. When Alden Whitman was the principal obit writer, he had this. Well, you tell it. I mean, he had this. The way he worked was he went and interviewed subjects, and they were always world figures,
Right.
big people.
And we still do that, and also now to a greater and greater extent, we're doing that on video, so that we can put that at nytimes.com as well.
Right.
So that we can supplement what's in print or what appears on the web textually with video obits. So we have that added advantage, and giving people, in a sense, that last word.
Yeah.
They're embargoed. That is to say, we say we're going to interview you, and we won't use it until you are dead. And people are pretty sophisticated. They understand that.
And-
I mean,
and Whitman-
sometimes we say, look, we're updating your biography.
Right.
You know, which is, of course, a euphemism, but most people get it,
People
and
don't.
most people understand because they want us to get it right, and that's part of their legacy.
I don't want to get off into journalism, byways here, but there is a question that it raises with Alden Whitman and what you know, he would interview these people, and the guarantee was, whatever you tell me now, it's not going to be published till after you're dead. My question is, what if there was news in what the person said, and now this organization is just going to hold on to this thing for ever?
Well, I can't tell you, about Whitman's, but I mean, we had one with Ed Koch where there was an interview for his video obit, and I think we asked. I'm not sure of the actual specifics, but I think we asked if there was something in it we could use earlier, and I believe he said no, and therefore we didn't.
Right.
And then it came out in the obit.
Let's get back to Jimmy. He, among the things he's credited with, I don't think he cared one way or the other, but being in the vanguard of the so-called new journalism.
Yeah, I don't think he would ever have called it that. I mean, he and Gay Talese and others were called new journalists, but I don't think it was new journalism at all. I mean, as he said, it was sort of like Dickens. I mean, they went out and covered things. They went out and listened to people. They didn't transcribe what they heard and saw, but they were great listeners, and they could hear the accent, the lilt,
Right.
the tone, and they caught it, and they could communicate it. And when you talk about great writing, that's what great writers do. They don't walk in with preconceptions. They don't walk in knowing what they're going to do. They walk in with a sense of curiosity. They walk in with questions. They don't walk in with preconceived answers. And they listen. And that's something that not enough of us do enough of these days. We think we know it all. We go to websites and TV and radio that tell us more of what we think we already know. And these are people who go out and want to hear what they don't know and learn new things all the time.
Briefly, Sam, does the rise of digital and the decline of print somehow diffuse this? Or are there any great columnists on?
I think good writing is good writing in whatever, as we now say, platform it appears. I don't think that matters. I do think, though, when you talk about the impact of someone like Jimmy Breslin in a paper like the Daily News, it is tough to replicate that kind of power, that kind of influence, that kind of leverage in a way today that you had it, particularly on a small scale in a city like New York, that we had it with the Daily News and Jimmy back then.
Sam, it's been extraordinary and wonderful to have you here talking about Jimmy. We're going to close this show with Jimmy himself reading from a book, reading from a column he wrote about himself in the third person. And by the way, these clips we've been using come from a remarkable series that was right here on CUNY called Irish Writers in America. Sam, thank you. Here's Jimmy.
Jimmy Breslin is too fat. He drinks too much. He smokes too much. And if he makes it past his 40th birthday, a lot of clockers and watchers are going to be surprised. But he is not entirely uncaring about this. As he puts his cigarette down on the edge of the bar at Gallagher's on West 52nd Street and sips from his half-empty beer glass, he complains that he isn't feeling well. Most often he says that his circulation is going bad on him the way it went on Whitey Ford. And if you think pitchers need their arms, you should just know that a writer also needs his fingers. If the circulation isn't that troublesome, for the moment, he can work up a pretty good case for the fact that his column isn't going as well as it should, or that the governor is avoiding him, or that his wife, Rosemary, is upset with him again. And with every complaint comes a flow of reminiscence and anecdote that is almost uninterruptedly funny. It takes a happy man to sing a worried song that way.